Okay, so we are at our second to last chapter. This chapter is Romanesque. Let's begin. So, in this chapter, we see Roman like architecture, a clear focus on relics and reliquaries, which had been important in Christianity but really gain a higher level of importance during this period. We'll talk a little bit about the Crusades, which were an important reason for warfare, for the interaction for trade around this time. Also, during this time, we have this apocalyptic mood going on. So, remember, around the year 1000, everyone was really nervous about the end of the world. That kind of mood will continue to survive and stay around for a while. Then we will see the Romanesque style spread from France and Spain over to Germany and Italy. So we'll see examples of different styles in architecture spread across those countries in this lecture. So going over the bullet points on the slide, this chapter was influenced by the Byzantine period and wanted to develop a new form of architecture. Pilgrimage type churches had a nave, side aisles, transept, and apse with radiating chapels. The second level used an ambulatory to help control crowds. So, if the nave was completely full, the second story would be used to gather more people or house more people. Cathedrals were whole complexes, not just one building. Um, there was a revival in stone sculpture around the entrances to the buildings. Always the west facade. Facade again means the face of a building. We will see distinct artistic personalities develop, and there's also going to be new terms and kind of knowing their meaning and place. So, just to add to the overview, mainly we'll talk about architecture with some additions of um, some sculptures, or as we will call them in this chapter, reliquaries. So we are in Europe around the year 1100 CE, so quite a bit of another time jump. Romanesque just means Roman-like. Um, but we have to be careful not to use the term Romanesque just to describe anything that looks ancient Roman. This is a very specific period in the later part in the Middle Ages, just before the Gothic period um, really starts taking a hold. So just be sure when you're using the term Romanesque, you only use it to describe this period. What we do see or would call Roman-like is when we talk about the types of architectural features of ancient Rome. So things like semicircular arches and a lot of masonry or stonework. More about that will come later. So Romanesque art, the age of pilgrimage. Romanesque means Roman-like. This era takes its name from the art rather than the geography or location. Romanesque towns were really monasteries with churches. 11th and 12th century hundreds, if not thousands, of buildings were built or remodeled. Pilgrimages were the source of funding for these monasteries. Um, the monasteries held relics of the saints. It really began as a cult of relics, which conceptualized the architecture. Um, so basically comes from pilgrimage and monastic movement. And architecture was ready, waiting for the pilgrims with stone vaults and new concepts about God's house. It's called the period of church salvation. Romanesque Gothic saves Christianity. Um, so to begin, uh, on the right, we see an example of a reliquary from France in Conquest, which is an important pilgrimage church. This represents Saint Foy, um, and it includes an ancient Roman helmet and cameos. It included beautiful stones and precious gems. The cameos is kind of known as the shawl or the draping around the shoulders. That type of fabric would have been typically just really jeweled at the time. It's a very ornamented work that celebrates an early Christian martyr and is said to hold her relics, the relics of this important martyr. So this was something that it was kind of like a container. So reliquary, as I have written on the slide, is a container for holy relics. So that's how reliquaries worked. The actual relic is inside of the body part or object of this holy figure. So the holy figure actually, if they were to touch the object or garment that they wore, this was considered sacred and it was placed inside the reliquary. So, the idea is that you make it as beautiful as possible to speak highly of these relics, which were real generators of income and of interest for different churches. So, if a church had an important relic and a reliquary, that meant that the church was going to get more visitors, more pilgrims coming to your church. And Conquest was an important pilgrimage church. So you would have visitors making their pilgrimages and making sure that they stopped at this church to see some of the important relics and reliquaries there. The church benefited from this because the more people that came, the more money they got from these visitors. Think of it as kind of a traveling show, okay? Um, you go and visit all of these churches and you kind of pay to see the relics and reliquaries. And then we have a map of a typical like pilgrimage. Um, so they'd start in Spain and they'd walk to France and then even extend to England, Germany, Italy, countries like that. So, in terms of architecture, pilgrimage churches contained um, a typical Romanesque setup. So this included a, barrel vaults, rounded arches, narrow halls, small windows, if any windows, an ambulatory, so that's our second story, and a crossing. So if you recall the longitudinal plan for a church, this is that crossing that I'm talking about. You'd have your main nave area, and then off to the sides were rooms where reliquaries were housed. So here we have images of Santiago de Compostela. Um, it's located way at the end of northern Spain. So what people at the time thought of as the end of the world, since the Americas haven't been discovered yet. So going back to pilgrimages, these pilgrims would make their way all the way through the western coast of Spain to this church and visit its relics. So already we see some differences from past structures. Looking at the inside, we have a second floor. Romanesque, we see our arches. But what's new and kind of developed are these rib-like structures on the ceiling. These are called ribs and they're meant to support the ceiling. And of course, we see modern day additions such as like lights. Typically, back in the day, those were not used. Obviously, electricity was not a thing, so the place would be lit up by candles. Again, this is a perfect example of a modern addition. typically, yeah, it wouldn't be this brightly lit, but modern accommodations had to be made. So here we have a typical pilgrimage plan, kind of similar to our longitudinal plan that we saw in our early Christian lecture. Um, we see things such as radiating chapels. So, what radiating chapels are these little kind of rounded areas or like little bumps sticking out at the end, or these they're called radiating chapels. This is where the relics were easily stored. So, each one of these little rooms, in the center of it, there would be a relic that people would come and see. Also, we tend to see large barrel vaults done in masonry. So this adds vaulting, and it's like vaults of the heavens. So again, we get symbolism to the sky and heaven. These ribbed barrel vaults added protection from fires as well. So there are no longer any flat timber roofs. Also, they are made from stone, so it's protecting the church. This is also a bit of a downside because they are so heavy. Um, there is not a lot of light in these churches. They tend to be pretty dark and dungeon-like. So we have a couple of repeating terms. We have a narthex, a nave, which is our main center room, transepts, so our cross, and then sometimes there'd be ambulatories, side aisles, things like that. There is a video that goes along with this slide, but another thing we tend to see in Romanesque churches is a lot of sculptural decoration within the churches themselves. So yeah, we tend to see in Romanesque churches a lot of sculptural decoration, but not the kind of heavy figures we see in Greek or Roman periods. These figures tend to be built a bit thinner. It's important to remember that the human body is a little de-emphasized at the time, a little bit abstracted during this period. The emphasis isn't on the person, but more on spirituality. It also keeps people from having any kind of impure thoughts about the human body when you're inside the church. So, what we tend to see is along the naves and the side aisles of churches are these beautifully sculpted column capitals. Here is one example of those capitals. It's called Samson and the Lion. It tells the story from the Old Testament that may allude to this idea of Christ's struggle or fight with the devil, this idea of fighting off sin or fighting off challenges or fighting off evil. These capitals can be read on multiple levels, and the video does a really good example of explaining these different levels that can be, I guess, read through the capitals. We have a new term. This term is timampiums, and it refers to the vertical recessed triangular space forming at the center of a pediment, typically decorated. A post and lintel system over the entrance. Later, a more mature Romanesque would create an elaborate timampium. It used to get the worshipper's mind on God, the judger. And here is how it would kind of look. So we have, just to break it down, post, lintel, and then our timampium. And then, of course, the breakdown of the arch. So once again, we have voussoir, so our individual stone archivolts, which we know from Greek columns, and then tympanum, which usually In these tympanums, there are scenes of the Last Judgment, and the next slide will go into that some more. So this particular tympanum is at Vézelay, and it depicts it's kind of rather an unusual portrayal of the Last Judgment. The imagery was chosen specifically to help justify the Crusades, in which the tympanum would play a big role when the First and Second Crusades were announced at the church. So we see Jesus standing as the central figure, giving his apostles the missions of converting the world to Christianity. Along the arch, there are various scenes of people who have been or who soon are to be christened. So we see these people up top here. On the lintel, so over here, there is an additional group, a group of who was thought to live at the very ends of the earth. These were these were ugly people who were most feared. So in a sense, these were people that did not convert to Christianity, so they were kind of damned to hell. These ugly and bizarre creatures were added to the lintel just to help justify the Crusades and their mission to convert such monstrous races, as they put it. The world was largely undiscovered at this time. Certainly, they did not know how much more of it was left to be found. So this is our tympanum that is found in France. And again, these were to prepare people for worship. These were found out on the outside arches above the doors leading into the churches. So when you walk up to the church, you look up and this is what you see to kind of get you ready into that mindset. And then we kind of have a closer look. Then we have an English example of a cathedral. So this is Durham Cathedral, found in England, northern England. It sits overlooking the water, or the river in northern England, the Wear River. There are carved chevron designs in the ceiling, which is a new feature. The new features also include two larger bays, 2 times larger than any other bays. Earliest known ribbed groin vaults over a 3-story elevation. So the 3rd story is known as a clerestory, and there's a sept partate. And what that means is that in each one of these chevron sections, there are 7 ribs. So sept meaning 7, partate, rib. So in each section, there are 7 ribs supporting the ceiling. So Durham is kind of a hybrid, or from the last presentation, syncretic cathedral, meaning that it has both Romanesque and Gothic qualities to it. Next up is St. Etienne, the Conqueror's Church, because of William of Normandy. Striking rib work throughout, and has a small clerestory to let light in. So we see the clerestory up here, ambulatory, and then narrow passageways. The ribs do the work of keeping the vault and walls from collapsing. Think of ribs as the skeletal structure of these cathedrals. This has a sexpartite rib, so meaning that there are 6 ribs in each bay. Around the piers are engaged columns as well. I lost my mouse, but if you look at the columns near the arches, there we are. This is what I'm referring to. So around the piers are engaged columns. So engaged columns meaning that they're not standalone columns, that they are engaged with the wall. They're connected to the wall. They add additional support. And this is an unusual design for Romanesque, but it still works. And lastly, for Romanesque, um, we kind of come full circle and see the Romanesque style going into places like Italy. And let me go back. Uh, Obviously, very famous series of structures, which we see here at the cathedral complex at Pisa, most famous for its leaning tower. But we see that Romanesque style with the emphasis on semicircular arches. So we see these semicircular arches in above the windows. So right there. Although we are in Italy, we still see a strong influence coming from ancient Rome basilicas with the flat roofs. So we kind of do have flat roofs, no, not so much domed. And this is, in fact, or this doesn't have any barrel vaults. If you go inside the cathedral, so here we have more different views of it from the outside. There it is next to the Leaning Tower. So looking at it from the inside, we see that there is a flat roof, so no vaulting or rib, but we have a lot of semicircular arches that are within it. And you can see later on they added Gothic elements. Oops. So going back to, you could kind of see them in this slide. But on the outside, there are Gothic elements known as um, gables with little crockets sticking out. So there are those little prickly elements that we tend to associate with Gothic period. And they're usually found, they're the little kind of detail work around the windows. And I'm sorry that I don't have a better view of them. But it's the really finicky, over elaborate detail work that's so ornate. And you'll see a better example of it in the Gothic presentation. But just know that that this specific structure at Pisa is also kind of syncretic because it has Gothic elements. And then we see the Gothic style spread on after this period. So that is it for Romanesque. And I'll see you in the Gothic presentation.